pleasure to be here. It's quite a remarkable event, and unlike others that I have attended, I tend to go to a lot of conferences, other industry conferences, where there's a lot of guys who look like me, talking about similar things, and very technical, and not often engaging students in such a broad body of individuals. I must say, over the last couple of days, I've been very impressed with the level of conversations. And particularly yesterday, I had the pleasure to be in the working group that was looking at the overarching plans, the master plans, and I was truly impressed by the breadth and the depth of the conversation, the areas being discussed, the topics being discussed, and the interaction. So thank you to Chad and the others for allowing me to participate in this event. I do stand up here with some trepidation. You know, I called my wife after Amory Lovin spoke, and I said, you know, I've got a kind of a problem following this guy. I just heard the Sermon on the Mount. And so she said, you'll do fine, honey. So then I called her again yesterday, and I said, guess what happened? She said, what? I said, I just listened to David Orr, and she said, what's he all about? And I told her, and she said, well, I still like being married to John Liver. So, you know, and I don't have the honorary degrees, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express. Okay, so I've already made you laugh twice more than David did yesterday. So, all right, now I got to figure out how to make this thing work, and we'll be off and running. The other thing Amory made me feel good about was my undergraduate degrees in German literature and rowing, which is pretty useless from an energy perspective. And then he made me feel good about that, and then worse because I have an economics degree. And but at least my economics degree is in development economics, third world stuff, so it doesn't really count. So what we're going to talk about today, if I can make this move forward. Oops. Which is all about disruption and innovation. And disruption in the energy industry is fascinating. It's different than a lot of other industries. It's pretty easy to be disruptive in software because you have two kids in a garage and some software. In energy, you're dealing with regulated utilities, you're dealing with a lot of heavy machinery, and you're dealing with business models that are already years old. So to start with this morning, on an upbeat note, let's talk about some of the constraints. So Amory's brittle power grid, that phrase emanates from him. And that means we have a power grid which is pretty close to failing, and a lot of the machines on that grid, transformers, transmission lines, are older than I am, which tells you we have a problem. And on any given day, on average in the United States, 500,000 people are without power for 2 hours. In Singapore, that number is a small percentage of that. In most other developed countries in the world, they work a lot better than we do. We have not invested what we need to in the power grid, to the tune of about $11 billion a year, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. We're underinvested in our grid. We have carbon constraints we know about. We have the climate change we've discussed. Water scarcity is becoming an increasingly larger issue. To frack a well in Pennsylvania takes between 3 and 4 million gallons of water for each well, very little of which is reclaimed. Power plants need tens of thousands of gallons for a thermal plant. And if you use dry cooling, it's not as efficient, so you lose your generating efficiencies. Last year, where I live, it was warm enough in the summer during the heat wave that the Pilgrim power plant had to reduce its production because they were dumping hot water into Cape Cod Bay, which was already at 75 degrees. The Department of Environmental Conservation in New York has asked 9 Mile Point, the nuke on the Hudson, to shut down for as many as 42 days a year. That's a lot of lost money. What they're trying to do is avoid the impact on migrating fish, which are also, as we all know, critically important. So we're starting to see these trade-offs and a lot more tension between the system than we did when there were a lot fewer of us claiming a lot fewer resources. And then we have an aging utility workforce. We all know about population growth. And then we have this thing called leadership, or not, in Washington. And some of you might have seen the Shaheen-Portman Efficiency Act, which Senators Rob Portman, Republican, and Eugene Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, tried to get passed. It was bipartisan legislation. The goal was to implement new standards, efficiency standards, training for students, and the estimates were that it was going to create 200,000 jobs a year and save billions of dollars. Well, when it came up for a vote, Republicans, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, although I can be, they wanted to tack some more amendments on that, and it was also during the Keystone Pipeline thing. So ultimately, that legislation, one of the few hopeful pieces of legislation, failed. At this point in time, I don't think we can expect the solutions to come out of Washington. You really have to, it's like water through a stone wall. We have to creep around wherever we can because it's not going to come from there. Washington at this point is a lot like, you might have heard that story about the Russian who could be anyone, but in this particular case it was Russian, because the Russians don't generally tend in their stories to like each other. So this Russian walks down the street to the beach and he sees a little lamp and he rubs it. Russians are jealous of each other in this story. Now, if there are any Russians here, I apologize, but I had to find some nationality. So he rubs the lamp and a genie pops out and the genie says, "You can have one wish." And the guy says, "Well, that's really cool. One wish." And he says, "Are there any catches?" And the genie says, "Yeah, whatever you get, your neighbor gets two of." And so, like any good congressman would say, he'd said, "Take this one." And that's what we see in Washington right now. Even if it's a good idea, whoever brings it out, it seems like the other party's opposed to it. It doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. We just see total gridlock. Luckily, at the state level, like we see here, and at the city level, municipalities, particularly in the cities, we are still seeing tremendous signs of progress, but it's not coming from Washington. Now, there is cause for optimism. We have really rapid innovation. We have new technologies. We have a lot of investment in financing models, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have increased speed to market. With computers and with the ability to interact with each other and our planning spreadsheets and so on, our planning capabilities are so much better, as I witnessed yesterday in this conversation around the master plan. And then this whole speed of innovation, dissemination of knowledge. We can now run simulations and iterations for things that used to take years of real-time experience. We now can do that in a lab in a short period of time. I write for Forbes, and because I write for Forbes, I have the interesting opportunity to talk to a lot of CEOs and practitioners in the field of renewable energy and smart policies and so on. One time last year, I was invited to the Wind Testing Technology Center in Boston. And this is just outside of Boston in Charleston. And it's a really cool place. The room is enormous. It's like an aircraft hangar. And companies pay about $250,000 to have their wind turbine, the blades, tested, these big fiberglass blades. You basically lay down half of an eggshell, another eggshell, glue them together, and then they bring them in there on a ship. They hoist them up on a crane, bolt them to the wall with these enormous bolts, and then they shake them 2 million times sideways, 1 million times up and down to test 20 years of environment. We're looking at 6 to 8 to 10 megawatt turbines that make the Statue of Liberty look tiny. So these things are enormous and they have to withstand all that weather out there, and they're multi-million-dollar investments. And so essentially, we can now iterate and figure these things out a lot faster than we could. And when you go upstairs in this lab, you see the sine waves on the computer. So I was asking the director, what's the most fun thing to do here? Because this looks pretty boring. And he goes, well, the rebar in this building is 165 feet into the ground for one specific reason. And he smiled. And I said, what's that? And he says, at the end of the test, we get to break every blade. And so he said, if it wasn't 165 feet, when we start putting the torque on these, we might rip the floor out of this place. So what they do is they put these tremendous pulleys around the blades, and then they start to apply pressure, crank it down and down and down. And I said, what happens then? And the smile lit up his face, and he said, when those things explode, it's the coolest thing you ever saw. Stuff just goes flying everywhere. And I said, well, can I get a video for Forbes? Because that'd be cool. And he goes, no, that's all highly confidential. I couldn't even tell whose blade was who in there, because they don't want you to know. Because all the new customers come in to see how they do it, and they don't want, GE and Siemens and all the others don't want them to know which blade. My friend who works in the industry goes, that's a GE, that's a Siemens. It's pretty easy to tell from his perspective. But he said they then take the slow motion films and send them to the blade developers, and he says, without exception, They have told him watching those blades get ripped apart gave us new ideas for how to make things better. So instead of 20 years of real world experience, you can do this in 6 months to a year and therefore advance the cause more rapidly, which is pretty cool. This whole world we're living in right now is about substituting raw materials with intelligence and technology. I walked in this morning, and Jerry Marshall, who is the energy manager here, was outside. What was he doing? He was messing around with a dimmer switch on the 300 LED lights. You'll see them when you go outside, right here in Roseland. Those lights replaced 60-watt incandescents, basically reducing that load from 18,000 kilowatts to 2,000. I'm sorry, 18,000 watts to 2,000 watts. That's a huge energy savings. Really simple. You know, how many people does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, first you have to think about it. And he did. And so why is that important? That's important because when you take a coal plant, for example, and you put 100 units of energy into that coal plant, when you burn that coal, you lose about 62% of the energy right there, leaving you 38. Then you put it on the transmission lines, lose another 2%, sometimes more. Now you're down to 36 if it gets to a campus or a house. If you use the rest of that in an incandescent light bulb or some other stupid thing like that, but an incandescent bulb is essentially, that's a heater masquerading as a light source. You're losing 95% of the energy that goes into that filament in the form of heat that you generally don't want. So if you can change that, basically you need a lot fewer coal plants all the way up the line because you avoid all that additional waste. That's what we're talking about, substituting raw materials with technology. Now, one of the things you hear about a lot, people talk about, oh, we did this, we did that. It's the equivalent of taking 10,000 cars off the road, 15,000 cars off the road. So one day, I thought to myself, well, what does that really mean? And I was going to invest in some solar on my roof. And then I realized how expensive it was. But I thought, it'll take this many cars off the road. I decided not to do it. So I had like 20 cars I would have taken off the road, but I didn't want to spend the $15,000, $20,000 on the solar. So that night, it really started to get under my skin. So I had a drink. Then it got under my skin some more, so I had another beer. Then it really started to annoy me. So I had another beer. By this time, it was dark. I shouldn't have been in my car, but I got in my old Ford F-150, and I decided to take some cars off the road. So I drove to the local dealership, and I really wasn't paying attention. I should have, because it turns out I wiped out about 20 cars. But guess what? In the morning when I woke up, half of them were electric vehicles, and the other half were Priuses. So I didn't do anything. So, but actually, with the equivalent of taking the car off the road, I did look it up. It's a car that drives 11,493 miles per year. Yes, they have a number for that. And it gets 20.5 miles to the gallon, this fictional car that the EPA and others use when they take a car off the road. And it's 4.8 tons of carbon. So, kind of the next time you see how many cars have been taken off the road and you want to contribute, just go to the dealership. Now, these trade-offs are becoming clearer. We know more and more about this. When I used to go to a cocktail party and talk about energy, people's eyes would glaze over. When I talk about most things, people's eyes glaze over. But when I talk about energy these days, people actually pay attention. And Chris Halpin mentioned this, that people pay attention to him too. So I thought, wow, we really must be onto something if they're paying attention to both of us. But people ask all the time now about energy efficiency and about solar and about what's happening in the market. And what's happening in the market right now, it's really fascinating. The Economist had this piece 4 or 5 months ago about the Cambrian period in the world when all the building blocks of life came together 540 million years ago. And suddenly there was this massive explosion in the evolutionary process of new life because all the building blocks were there. The temperatures were right, the carbon was there, all the pieces were there. And we are now, according to them, and I would submit to you that they're right, we are now in the Cambrian period for innovation and disruption. And it's an interesting place to be because a lot of the people who are innovating right now. First of all, you have computational capability. You have the ability to communicate all over the world and find like-minded groups of people working on the same problems. You have access to money like we didn't have before, whether it's ARPA e-money or whether it's venture capital and so on. And you've got serial entrepreneurs, people who just want to build things and create things, and they really, in some cases, don't care about the consequences. They just want to change things or see if this thing works. So one guy that I met a few years ago when I was working for Constellation, he was that serial entrepreneur. This guy was a genius. He, one of the things I couldn't talk about for a while, but he was building meat. He was actually creating meat in a laboratory with the idea that if we could clone cells and turn them into hamburger meat, that we could feed people something that they were used to, that they liked the taste of, and we wouldn't have all the issues with bovine flatulence and water use for cattle and so on. So one thing he was doing was trying to grow meat in the lab. Another thing he was doing, he was the CEO of Konarka. And Konarka was trying to create solar using the old Polaroid plant in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to print it, create wearable solar. First for the military, because they could put it on tents and that sort of thing. And for any of you entrepreneurs out there, I would hate to say it, but it's sometimes true. If you can find a good energy renewable technology and also find a way to use it to kill people, you'll get more money for it. It's actually a lot of the technologies out there that are doing real well, whether it's microgrids or solar and so on, or flywheels. The military is ahead of everybody else in figuring out how to use it and how to adopt it. It's an unfortunate truth, but we need to use it to our advantage. So this guy was actually trying to create clothing that you could wear with solar on it. And he was such a serial entrepreneur, and he was always thinking about things. He told me that he woke up in the morning and there would be yellow stickies all around his house with equations on them and other things, problems he had solved the night before when he was sleepwalking. And I thought, man, wouldn't that be so great? You could work 24/7 and still get your REM cycles in. But he actually did this. There are people like that out there. Now, what's so interesting about this Big Bang disruption right now, which is the new terminology, is they're not even looking at your business sometimes. They're just trying to build. In the old days, the model, Christensen's model, Clayton Christensen from Harvard, he's sort of the guru around discussions around innovation and disruption. How does it happen? His model was that companies would essentially pay attention to their clients who provided them with the highest margin, the most loyal clients who wanted the highest scale products. And when we worked at Constellation, we did the same thing. We would look at our biggest, most loyal customers, the ones where we got the most value add, and we would try and really please them because we really wanted that margin. And at the same time, the new innovators and disruptors come in and they focus on the bottom. This happened with disk drives, it happened with computers, it even happened with some cell phones and steel mini mills, and there are many other industries, same sort of thing happened, where they focus on the bottom, building cheap and mass production, and then they move upscale and knock the incumbent out of the way. Now, in our industry, in electricity, the incumbents are still the electric utilities, and they have that regulated monopoly, which they, in some ways you should argue should, because you don't want 15,000 wires and poles running everywhere. But they also have a mindset where a lot of them are close to retirement. They don't want a lot of change. There's another guy I know who's a CIO of a utility out in Seattle, and he wants to change everything. He wants to put information every place, smart meters everywhere, know the prices all along his system, and get efficiency with GIS and all this. And I said to him, sounds like you could save a lot of money and make yourself more efficient. He goes, yeah, but I got 4 guys with 3 or 4 years left in their careers, and none of them want to do anything that's risky, that could cause a problem. And he says, so that's a problem. And I said, yeah, and it's also an opportunity. If you can wait out those 1,400 days until they're gone, you can hire your own clones. So that's what he's thinking about doing. Now, what's going on in terms of those technologies? This is a Clean Energy Patent Growth Index. And you can see what happens right around 2008, everything starts to increase. Because a lot of new ideas of clean energy are coming. A lot of things really started to happen at the end of the aughts. Here's where those are happening. You probably can't read this, but so the biggest one there is fuel cells. There were a lot of patents there. Wind was pretty good, and then you can see solar in the yellow goes straight up, almost. just so many innovations happening in a number of areas in renewables, which is really exciting because it portends so much change out there. I get these feeds every day from Rice University and other places, and they're always coming up with new battery technologies, new ways of storing energy in fiber, new ways of creating nanotechnologies. Now, we can't always think technology is going to save us, but we certainly are going to have to harness it where we can. And the fact that all this is happening is pretty exciting. Worldwide, same thing. And wind power has a huge number of patents because everyone's focused on that. The Europeans and the Asians are really moving wind along even faster than we are. And climate change adaptation is interesting. There in the yellow, you know, there are people focusing on that as well. All this to point out that there's this Cambrian soup out there. There's this evolution going on that is going to unleash not only the technologies we see today, but the technologies of tomorrow and the years to come. So David Elliott was here from Cree the other day and talking about his products, and he's an interesting innovator. Most of these innovative companies, the real disruptors, they're not going to be the Siemens and the Honeywells and the GEs, because those guys don't have the same fire in the belly, and they're more about shareholder value and that sort of thing, and protecting some of what they have. Not all, but a lot of it, and the culture is kind of like that. But companies like Cree and these the energy storage companies, the battery companies, they're all pure plays. They're all looking to do one thing, which is to invent, promote, pilot their technology, and then push it into the market as rapidly and successfully as they can. Their end goal, in many cases, is to be bought out by the likes of the Philips and the GEs, etc. So they'll eventually be the places where they go to die in some cases. But then the entrepreneurs leave and they start something new, and they do the whole thing again and again and again. And it's really fascinating to watch how that works. When my colleague Leighton Wolf and I were at Constellation, one of the things we did was we created this technology called Virtuot. And with Virtuot, we created the capability for customers to see their usage in real time. So we put on a pulse meter, and then we would send a signal with cell phone to our office and pick it up in our computers and put it online. So people could see the real-time energy usage, which was huge. We sell $365 billion worth of power a year over a transmission system that's 10 times the length and breadth of the US highway system. So we're moving this stuff all around. It's super volatilely priced, particularly in competitive power markets, where one day it can be 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and the next day it can be $1 a kilowatt hour. And for companies not to know how much they're using, at what price it's at, that's like if you went and bought salad at a salad bar, and you basically put all the stuff on the tray, and at the end you handed it to the cashier, and he or she said, "We'll send you a bill next month." And you're like, "For how much?" "Well, you didn't ask me when you bought it." That's how we buy power in this country. We don't even know what the price is when we consume it. So how can we be expected to consume it wisely and intelligently? There aren't price signals that then create those elasticities, those changes in behavior in response to price. So we built this platform, and steel mills for the first time could see how much they were using. And we had one customer, which was a big aggregation cement manufacturer. They just crushed rock all day long. They crushed big boulders and turn them into smaller boulders, and then eventually turn them into gravel. All electric energy. 10, 15, 20 megawatts worth of power. And if they shut those things off, the rock just sits there in the crusher and smiles at them. It doesn't hurt the process, they can turn them right back on again. So these guys were taking the price signals from us for all the different markets, and they were saying, oh, there's a difference between price here and price there. Let's produce as much aggregate as we can at this facility, as long as we have enough reservoir on site over here, inventory. And so they were changing their production schedules in response to the real-time market prices. They were optimizing what they were doing within the context of the market and being more efficient about it because they knew what was going on. So we built Virtuot, and we trotted it out to my boss and then that boss's boss, and then eventually the CEO of the company saw it, and he was pretty impressed by it. And a little while later, this edict came down that said 5% of our revenue from now on is going to be through new innovation. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Well, then fortunately, I got invited to the innovation committee at this large energy company I was at. So what did the innovation company do? Well, the innovation committee. We spent the first 2 months trying to determine what innovation was. That gives you a sense of the problem, isn't it? So within a year, all the guys on the innovation committee that I thought were innovative, myself included, had taken severance when we got bought and we were all doing new things. But before that time, because we built this virtual thing and I was known as somewhat of the troublemaker and the innovator, my boss asked me to put together a slide deck discussing how we could reach that 5% goal. So I came in and I had a very short slide deck. And I should have been more politic, but I kind of had a sense where this would go. So the first slide had an equation on it. And the equation was simple. 100% of 10 is greater than 10% of n. And my boss said, what's that? And I said, if you want people to innovate, have them do it full time. It's not a committee thing. It's not something they do as part-time. The winners focus on this 100% of the time, and they even sometimes walk around sleepwalking at night, still focused on it. And he goes, okay, that makes sense. We'd have to hire some people. I said, which brings me to my second slide. So we flipped over the slide and said, what's that? I said, oh, that's easy. It's the severance agreement. I said, why are you talking about a severance agreement? I said, because anybody smart enough to be an innovator and come in here and do this knows that the life cycle of a product, between innovation and pilot and getting it out there with contracts and testing and figuring out what the market wants and all that stuff, it's going to be 3 to 5 years. And we all know that somewhere in that 3 to 5 year cycle, our sales cycle isn't going to look so good. And the first thing this company will do is look at the non-performers and lay them off, which will be us, right? And he said, probably. I said, hence the severance agreement. And he said, well, we can't do that. I said, well, then this has been a very efficient conversation, hasn't it? And essentially, that's kind of what happened to innovation at the company I was at. But not with Cree, and certainly not, again, solid state lighting. Look at this. The volume of lamps installed, including the 300 outside. These are for type A, which is the type A. We have the A-type lamp is that standard incandescent lamp. So look at that rapid penetration rate. And in 2013, it's even higher, because where I live, you can now buy a Cree for $4.95 with Home Depot. So it's almost as cheap. It's as cheap as a CFL, and certainly on a life cycle basis, way more cheaper than an incandescent. And they last, tens of thousands of hours. And then solar. So here's solar, just over the last couple of years. And look at, in 2008, pretty much nothing going on. And then, boom, the technology gets ripe. Germany does its thing with a feed-in tariffs where they're paying 30 plus cents per kilowatt hour. That market was big enough to convince the Chinese in particular and the Malaysians that they would invest in solar plants at scale and put a lot of money into it. And so they essentially started building these massive factories over in China and shipping the panels, commoditizing them, and the price fell by about 70% over the course of 2.5 years. And so, boom, everything just takes off. And it will, at least until 2016 when the investment tax credit expires, which is a 30% federal tax credit. But this is a really impressive chart. And it's got the utilities kind of nervous, because the more people who put solar on their roof, those are kilowatt hours that are not being consumed anymore, but there's still an infrastructure that the utilities have to pay for. So this conversation about, yes, we have climate change, we have these other resource issues, we have to change, we don't have any choice to change. It also has to make room for the fact that there will be a high level of discomfort, and there will be winners and there will be losers. One conference I was at, this professor from Harvard Business School, she said, we need to ensure from the get-go that we think about and show compassion to the losers. For 2 reasons. One of them is, if you don't, they're going to fight you harder. And the second one is, you want to bring those people along. You got to get them involved in the conversation. If it's an us versus them, it's just not going to go anywhere. So compassion to the people whose models are being pushed out of the way is really important to think about and keep in the back of one's mind. Here again, another chart from the DOE of what that solar installation looks like. Costs come down, installations go up. And wind, same thing. Are we noticing a trend here? Whether it's on the demand side with the solid state lighting, or whether it's on the supply side with these new technologies, we're seeing some really rapid changes. Now, some of this obviously is tax driven, but the point of this is, the tax policy is, you create enough of a foothold for those infant industries so they can stand on their own. And in some cases, you were seeing wind contracts for less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And if If you take out the production tax credit, it gets a little bit more expensive than that. But the wind is a very viable resource. Now we still have the issue of firming. What do you do when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine? How do you deal with that? One of the things you can do is use your electric vehicles. So here again, same rapid curve. This last year in the US, we sold about 98,000 EVs. And we're on track to do about 130 or so this year based on the sales figures through June. And each one of those batteries can represent a problem for the grid, or it can represent a solution. So if you're charging at the wrong time of the day, you're increasing demand, but if you're charging at the right time of the day, you actually can potentially discharge back into the grid when the grid needs it and provide value. So one of the companies I talked to for a Forbes article is named Ideal Power, and they build converters. They basically are the ones that transform the power from the DC to the AC, or back, whatever's needed. So DC, for example, solar is DC and then it goes into an AC grid. And I was talking with the CEO of this company and he said, you know, one of the things we're doing with the Department of Defense is our V2G initiative, vehicle to grid. And I said, well, what does that look like? And he said, well, on those military bases, we've got renewables and we have some diesel and so on, but what we're trying to figure out is, how can we take those electric vehicle batteries, which are cheaper for us on a life cycle basis to use for transportation anyway, how can we multi-purpose those so that if it ever hits the fan, we basically can drive all of our electric vehicles to where we need the electricity and we can suck those vehicles dry. And I said, tell me more, this is interesting. He said, well, school buses are now at the point where on a life cycle basis, it's cheaper to use an electric school bus than a diesel-driven bus, because there's less wear and tear on the battery, on the engine, excuse me, and less maintenance required. And some studies just came out of the University of Delaware, and there's some pilots now on that. He goes, but think about school buses, when do they run? And I said 6:30 to 9:30 in the morning, and 1:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon. He goes, exactly. What if you charge those from solar during the middle of the day? And then, you know, you run it, and then whatever, basically lather, rinse, repeat that cycle we referred to yesterday. And he goes, what happens if you have another Katrina? Where do you shelter people? I said, the schools. He goes, right. And what did I just talk to you about? I said, school buses with energy storage. He goes, right. So if you have a hurricane type event or some other severe weather, take all of your vehicles and plug them into the school, and each one of those batteries would have the equivalent of about 4 days of a residential household, so there's a lot of energy sitting there that you could use for a secondary purpose. That's the kind of disruptive thinking out there in the business models that are emerging more and more every day. Here's what storage looks like right now. Now, it's a little bit further behind the solar and the wind and the EVs, but what's so fascinating as someone who's been in this industry for a long time is 5 years ago, if we had talked about solar or wind or LEDs, people didn't even have a notion of what the conversation was about, except for the really earliest adopters and sort of the geeks like myself. But most people didn't think that we'd be anywhere near the levels of adoption we are now. And what's happening now with these guys is there are companies who have all kinds of different battery technologies. You've probably heard about the Tesla and the gigafactory that they want to build with a lithium-ion battery. There's also a company that's making electrolyte. Electrolyte is essentially, you take a bat and you charge it with electricity. You store the power in the form of electrolytes, and then you run them through a membrane, and it releases the energy, and you can just recharge the bat again and again and again. And some of these guys have chrome iron technology, some have vanadium, some have other different technologies, a lot of different metals, and they're already testing a lot of these in places like India to back up the telecoms system in India where it's 140 degrees and they want to see how these really work in hostile environments, displacing diesel. We're starting to see them in places like Hawaii where energy is 30 to 35 cents a kilowatt hour. And we're starting to see these start to mainstream where the batteries are in places like California where they're helping customers avoid their peak demand charge. So they are now starting to inch into the marketplace and find their first footholds on a commercial basis. And when storage matures, that unlocks so many other things because it allows much more penetration of wind and solar because you can start to deal with that intermittency issue and integrate far more of those renewables onto the grid. This dance has a lot of different partners, and it involves a level of holistic thinking. It also involves a lot of data. When we had virtual, we were providing customers with 1 minute data with a minute latency. That is, they could see their usage a minute after it happened. So they could respond really quickly to what was going on and take the appropriate steps to change that all. And data is going to be critical. You need to know what the prices are, how much you're using, what the costs are. But storing that is going to be really important. And we also need systems thinking. Part of the challenge, and yesterday when I was in that planning session, I saw evidence of a very high level of systems thinking. What's so cool right now about what's going on is that, as Steve Howard, the Chief Sustainability Officer of IKEA says, you know, the great thing about new technology right now is low-hanging fruit grows back. So one of the things we talked about yesterday in the group was how often do you refresh the plan? Because we're not living in a snapshot environment. We are in the middle of a motion picture, and the frames are accelerating in that motion picture. So how often do we have to step back and look at that and take another snapshot of those frames? Where are we now? What do those alternative technologies look like now? The business model that didn't work yesterday, maybe today does. And we also have to be capable of thinking of a systems approach, not just what is the direct cost of that thing, but what are my savings? As Jerry Marshall said, you know, with these LEDs outside, I'll be retired before anyone has to change them, and then some. He's thinking about the saved maintenance costs and the avoided waste heat as well. How do you think about all those things together? And how do you make it profitable? Now here in this system, now I went online just to see what folks were using before I heard it from Amory and David. And it's $250 million a year just in the UNC system, a little bit under that. And with the community colleges and state agencies, it's an awful lot of money. And certainly we know there's been a lot of progress made to date, but there's a long way to go. So how do you do it? Well, we know some of that. Someone's got to be in charge. At least someone at every university or college has to be in charge. That commitment, the best companies that I talk to, institutions, it's real visible. They define those goals. They redefine those goals all the time because of the changes taking place. And they look for the interactions. They look for involvement. They look for those system-wide opportunities. Can we join with another group in purchasing more together and drive the cost down? And as we talked about here in these conversations, we define the culture that we want. The companies that I talk to for Forbes that do it real well, the first question I always ask them is, why? You know, how'd you come up with this idea? What inspired you? And then the how. Who did you bring on board? And almost every single time, it's this thing where it's not I did it. It's the whole group. And both Amory and David referred to Ray Anderson. He wrote Confessions of a Radical Environmentalist. And when he set those goals for Interface Carpet, he basically said, we're going to have zero waste and we're going to use renewable energy. And all of the people in his, when he announced that, in his auditorium, their jaws dropped. And one of them raised a hand and said, how? And he said, you're going to teach me how to do it, because I don't know. But if I set you all on this course, you'll help me figure it out. One of the things, again, I saw yesterday in this conversation was the exchange of best practice information, the flow of ideas that raises everybody's boat another level was really, really inspiring to me. And clearly, you all are moving in the right direction of creating that culture that you want. And then you got to know your cost structure. This is a bill from, actually, it's a Muni in Kentucky, and it has a lot of college use in it. And they pay, you can't see this as clearly as I hope you would, but their demand charge for the period of peak demand they use during a specific period of time is almost half of their bill. So they're not paying that much per kilowatt hour, it's 3+ cents per kilowatt hour, but they're paying an awful lot just to have the wires in the pole supersized. So they're focusing on how do we reduce those demand charges? And what does that mean? What does that look like? Know what drives your costs. This is a load duration curve essentially showing where you use your power. When you're up to 19,000 kilowatts, it's only a small sliver of time when you're really using that much electricity. So can we identify that? Can we look at the data, focus in on when that's happening, what's driving that energy use, and cut it? Because that's where you're going to find your major savings. And then, once you get that money and those savings, you can move downstream and find other opportunities. Here is a nice little spaghetti chart we had for a client where we basically showed them, here's one day that if you could bring this usage down from there to there, you could save $5,000 that month. Power of information is pretty remarkable. The next step here is to say, okay, what's driving that? What are the constituent elements? What are those assets that use power then that are causing that to happen? And if you could bring that down, from the top day down to the average day, there's $37,000 a month. That's an awful lot one can do. And then here's another example, just 2 bad days in March. I mean, these guys are really unfriendly. What's that Bactrian camel doing right there? Right, 2 humps. That's just out of control, and that's costing that place a lot of money. Now here, I had a chance to look at where do you buy your power, and it's Duke, obviously a big piece, and then the former Yugoslavia. I was blown away by the number of co-ops and munis. I mean, you have no negotiating power when you're dealing with, Bosnia and Serbia and Macedonia, etc. This is definitely a challenge. You can't just say, oh, we buy, $250 million worth of power, we want a better deal. Not when it's fractured like this. So I leave that to you. That's your problem. I didn't come here to solve that. I just wanted to show you had it. So those new approaches, what do we have to look at? Broader systems thinking. Let's focus on specific measures, a lot on the interaction. What is the market? Where are those costs hurting you most? And that's an interaction of your market structure, your electricity bill, and then how is your usage profile and your energy consuming assets affecting your energy costs? Then you make your efficiency investments, you're looking at your demand management. Wherever you can, automation makes sense, but you can't set it and forget it. Things always go wrong. But automation helps because you can't run around and do all those things all the time. We know that. And then ongoing behavioral changes. The companies that I spoke to that did the best had really strong cultures, and they said it's not just about investing in the technology, it's investing in the people, because they come up with the ideas, they notice when things are out of kilter, and they continually press us to do things better. So what does that world look like today in your traditional approach to energy management? We've got the ESCO, we call it 1.0 in our group. It's the typical energy conservation measures, your performance contracting model, simple ROI. It's great for capital constrained facilities, budget constrained institutions like we have here. And it's a model that's been around for an awful long time, been very successful. Where does it go? ESCO 2.0 starts to look at real-time usage, energy market data, your demand charges. It starts to look at that interaction between the market context and your consumption. And monitoring, especially looking at those larger pieces of equipment and sub-metering where it makes sense. It's not that expensive to sub-meter, and it can teach you an awful lot about where you're using your energy and what it's costing you. And then analytics, intelligent analytics, great projects for students. Great projects for students. And 3.0, that's where we're headed. This is where you basically are looking at all these technologies. You're looking at storage, you're looking at solar, you're looking at all these pieces and saying, how do they fit together? So yesterday, one of the conversations again in that group was about microgrids and resiliency and reliability. And what happens if, right here, you tend to have some pretty severe storms, or at least the potential for such. And you remember Sandy a couple of years ago, that storm slammed into New Jersey. And one area that sort of laughed at it was Princeton University, because they had a microgrid and they islanded from the grid, and they had lights on and everything was perfect. Meantime, one of the hospitals with backup diesel had nothing because the diesel didn't start. And a lot of companies or institutions that think that they have backup because they're relying on diesel, well, they do have backup unless there's a system-wide issue, like a Cat 3 hurricane that slams into a state and takes out 50% of the canopy and drives the grid out for a couple months. In Connecticut, after we had the Halloween snowstorm with a couple feet of snow, and we had Hurricane Irene, they wrote a thing for the governor, Danelle Malloy, called the Two Storms Report, and they estimated that if a Cat 3 hit New Jersey, they would lose 70% of their canopy, and they could be without power for 1 to 3 months, which is a life-threatening event. And if you have a generator with gasoline in it, and you think, oh, I'm going to still be able to watch ESPN, well, guess what? The gas station down the street doesn't run anymore. And we found that out in Hurricane Sandy. Nobody could get gasoline. So when you're talking about hardening a campus or a house or a police and fire safety, if you're looking just at liquid fuels, and we're looking at a system-wide emergency, you haven't planned properly. And there's a lot of value in having lights on when nobody else does, for safety reasons and continuity of business, etc. So one of the things that will start to emerge much more strongly in Connecticut and New Jersey are driving it because they're past the failure of imagination. They've been hit. So now they can imagine what that feels like. It's funny how we need to get whacked upside the head with a 2x4 to learn to duck the next time. But they're starting to focus on that. So you get the batteries, the emerging technologies. Wind and solar can't be interdicted the same way that liquid fuels can. Monitoring and management behind the meter, renewables, integrating the renewables, firming up the renewables so that they're actually giving you capacity value, so when the sun passes over and your solar doesn't generate, you dampen your demand someplace else in the system with demand response or pulling a battery on, so you still have a lower demand charge than you otherwise would, utilizing those different instruments like Symphony, so you're getting something that's more valuable than just the parts independently, and focusing on that redundancy and reliability. Clear leadership matters. In all the companies that do this well, the one thing that stands out, and you have it here in spades, or we wouldn't be at this conference, is clear leadership. Behavioral impact, the fact that you all are talking about the students here and how to involve them in this process and how to make this interactive means you got this thing nailed, the behavioral piece of it. And the culture, some really great stuff going on here. In fact, within the next few weeks, you can look forward to reading an article in Forbes about this summit, because I'm definitely going to put one out there. So let's talk about a few companies that have done it well, and we'll wrap it up because we're right at 9:40 right now. So Legrand, these guys make all kinds of electrical equipment. And they signed up for the Building Performance Challenge, which is to reduce power by 25% by 2020. And over their 14 sites in North America, they hit 32% in just 4 years. So I talked to the CEO, John Seldorf, and the VP of Energy Efficiency, Susan Rochford, and I said, how'd you get this done? And how come there are only 2 of you who've met these goals so far? And they basically said, start with the goal, articulate that goal, articulate it again, get the people involved, set up the processes, do the whole thing. No one does it alone, it's a team effort. And John Seldorf, the CEO, said, we basically just said, we're going to give this a try. We sell efficiency projects. If we can't do it here, and we sell metering and sub-metering, if we cannot do it here at Legrand, how can we sell that in our products to our customers? How can we ask them to walk the walk or talk the talk if we're not walking the walk, right? So they basically said, okay, we got to the 25%, let's go for more. So now they're aiming at another 20%. And they've been so successful in the United States, they engaged all their employees in a power down day just to see what they could do if they really cramp things down. And they got another like 10% over that. And now it's pushing off to Europe, to Legrand, Europe. And that's contagious. There's empowerment there. They were really excited about this project. University of Cincinnati. Joe Harrell's the VP of facilities there, and he's a lot like the people that I talked to yesterday. And they've done a whole bunch of different projects. And they said, the budget cuts made us have to get together and focus more and more on what we could do to squeeze, that penny so hard that Abraham Lincoln's eyes pop out, Get that money out of that wherever we can. So they started to work on a whole lot of different things, and they were ready for opportunities because they had this focus. So at one point, the Cincinnati football team has a pretty high profile. So they were building a practice facility, and Joe Harrell was kind of ashamed that, we have this really cool practice facility. We spent a lot of money on that instead of academics. But anyway, one of the engineers came up to him and said, if we move this wall over here where we need to, we could put an awful lot of water behind that. And Joe said, yes, we could. And so now they use that water to store and cool, right? That's their thermal dumping ground, reservoir, if you will. So they use 4 million gallons of water to cool the campus. And they did it because they were already focusing on opportunities and thinking a certain way. So when that thing came, that hidden opportunity, which would have gone unrecognized in 99% of the campuses across this country, or at least a few years ago would have, they saw something there that few other people would have seen. The other thing they did, yesterday we had Air Acuity in here talking about the air exchanges. They took their air exchanges in their lab from 10 to 15 times down to 4. And they had to involve all the different departments to make sure it was safe, that they weren't going to have any issues. And they essentially were able to cut out an entire steam boiler because they didn't need this massive air exchange anymore. So they sent me pictures of these guys with blowtorches cutting out the boiler and throwing it into dumpsters. Pretty cool stuff. Monadnock Paper. So the press flag from Monadnock Paper called and said, hey, we have a sustainability report. We'd really like you to write about us. And I'm like, everybody's got a sustainability report. Give me a hook. So he emails me back the next day. He goes, we're in the paper industry, and the rest of the industry is dropping like flies, and we're actually making a profit, largely because of what we've done in cutting costs. I said, I found my hook. Thank you very much. So I talked to the CEO, Richard Varney, who's a fly fisherman. The paper mill's on a river, right on the Conchoquoik River in New Hampshire, in a beautiful little town. He can see the steam from the plant from his house, this CEO. He came into the factory from his father. And basically he said, you get this done by having people in leadership positions that believe in it and get others on the train. The first thing he did was to hire Michelle Ham, who was the environmental person, and then they went into ISO 14001 and said, this is what we are committing to. And this is where we're putting our stake in the ground. And now they've achieved remarkable savings. They 2% year over year over year over year. It gets harder, but remember that low-hanging fruit does grow back. But it's a culture of looking for opportunities. And then finally, this is the IBEW, National Electrical Contractors Training Center in California. And the best projects are multidisciplinary. They involve the architects, they involve the users, they involve the financiers, they involve the planners, and they involve the whole community. And what do they do here? They basically said, we want to build a net zero training center for our electrical contractors, IBEW folks. And we want to make this place really state-of-the-art so that these students have a comfortable environment to work in, and they also can be disciples of the process. So they put together these 60 ideas, they crossed off a lot of them, they trusted each other, and they built a building where they said also, we decided that if there were 6 of us at the table, there was a 7th seat. And no, it wasn't in this case the Holy Ghost, it was nature. They said, that empty seat is going to be represented by nature. That is our partner. Where is the sun during different parts of the year? When do we get the breezes? Where do we need shade? How do we integrate that all in? Where can we have windows that open rather than being closed all the time with AC? And they built a place that they said feels like you're outside when you're inside the building most times of the year. And I said to them, what did you fail at? What was the biggest surprise? And they said the biggest surprise was we spent enough time up front thinking about this and vetting all these things and working them through that when we built the building, we knew we were going to screw up on something. And we didn't. That was our biggest surprise. The building was actually better than we thought that it could be. And our students love it. And that, I would propose to you, is your biggest surprise that's coming your way if you haven't recognized it already. What you're doing, this community here, with the conversations and the commitment and the effort, that interdisciplinary, leave the egos at the door and put the trust right out in front of you on the table, focus on something that's better for all of us, that will be your biggest surprise. And the community you build may be even a bigger surprise. The friendships, the laughter, and dare I say, the love that can be gained from that process of doing something that's bigger than all of us, that can be your biggest surprise. And with that, I thank you. Anybody with a question? Oh yeah, okay, in the back here.
Brian, Michael, the issue. You talk about reducing demand charge, for example, as a way for a business to save money. Do you ever use that as an argument to the utilities? Because it seems to me that the utilities would have a tremendous interest in reducing those peaks also. Do you use that as an argument say when a utility is hesitant to allow solar on the grid as a way to attract, as a way to make it attractive for the utility?
It can. I've found, in my experience, it really varies by the utilities. Some of the utilities are really proactively and aggressively focused on helping with the customers, and particularly if they have some new investment on the margin, a new transmission line, distribution, transformers, etc., and you are behind that new technology or investment they have to make, and you can help them to avoid that. Often you can be a real aggressive partner in that conversation. And I found that the munis in particular are interested, and co-ops are interested in helping customers manage peak demand. There's a guy named Billy Ray from Glasgow, Kentucky, who I also wrote a story about because he's integrating his cable TV system with his electric municipality to drive the message to customers that these are the days we're going to hit our peak demands, and these are the days I really need you to ratchet down demand because that's when we're paying the most money as a utility. I still want to sell you all the kilowatt hours that I can because that's where I make the revenue that allows me to pay my employees, but I want to do everything I can to avoid those peak demand charges and make the system more efficient. That is, push more kilowatt hours across a smaller infrastructure. So it really does depend upon who's sitting across the table from you and what culture they have. Anybody else? Yes?
Would you like to say anything more about parking campuses?
Parking?
Parking or...
Oh, hardening. Yeah, I would. So, I just dropped this thing. Yeah, hardening campuses, in my opinion, is going to get a lot more visibility in the future. And here's why, among other reasons. Let's start with the most critical things. Avoidance of pain, right? The major area of avoidance of pain generally has to do with your science labs. And there was a great, or not so great story about one of the schools that lost power and all the rats or mice died, the test animals, and they lost years of research. And you can imagine just how heartbroken the researchers were that all the animals died because they couldn't keep them cool enough and alive. So that they would have paid millions of dollars to avoid that pain, right? So a lot of times, you have to sort of turn that equation on its head and say, let me not think about what that is costing me, but let me think about how much it would hurt if I didn't have this. And in fact, all of us, we all complain about our electric bills as if it's a tax that we have to pay every day. You know, we take for granted the lights are going to come on, the fans are going to work, everything, and we just have to pay this bloody tax to the utilities, when in fact, if we didn't all have electricity, we would expire relatively quickly. So back to the campus thing, I think the way to do it is to look at it on a modular basis and start with something relatively small. Obviously, utilities have to agree, and different utilities have different conversations with you about this. Say, where do we really need to have a hardening of our grid? And it starts probably in the science facilities and life safety, communications capability, that sort of thing. And diesel just won't cut it. Long term, it's not a viable, liquid fuels are not viable that way, but renewables and storage are. So then, you know, and these costs are going to keep falling, and business models are getting better. I'm doing an article right now with the one of the founders and the chief strategy officer of Princeton Power, which were kids at Princeton University who started microgrid electronics in the, say, mid-2000s, 2004 or something, with a professor, and then they got angel funding, and now they're one of the leading practitioners around microgrid development. And they have a really cool project in Alcatraz and so on. And they said it's still a very immature industry. We're being asked to do more things and more adjacencies than we would like, and we can't specialize because it's still so immature. But the maturation is happening really, really quickly, driven by DOD and driven by Connecticut's DEP program, which Chris Halpin and Celtic are involved in, and many others. And so that state of knowledge is advancing quickly, and I would submit to you all here, you should be thinking about the value of having certain assets when your campus is hardened. And what does that look like 1 year, 2 years? With Sandy, about 30% of the respondents, of 600 people who responded to a survey, said they were without power for 2 weeks or more. And about 40% were 1 week. So well past when your diesel would work. So you really have to think about those things, and again, it starts with what's the avoided cost, what's the avoided pain, because you can justify a completely different level of investment when you think about it that way versus then, oh, I want this thing to generate power for me. Does that make sense? Anybody else? Yes?
You said earlier that we have to show compassion to losers, right?
Uh-huh.
And as these technologies make ground and they replace the old systems, right?
Yeah.
How do we show compassion towards them, such as the Duke Energies and other monopolies that are controlled? And what can we actually learn from them?
It's a really good question. And sometimes, there are times when, and Bill McDonough, who's a really interesting person, who's a leading thinker in this whole sustainable space, is sometimes you have to recognize how much time you can spend on the conversation and how, then when it simply doesn't make sense, it's just wasted energy. And there will be some, I think you start with trying to think about compassion and understanding their viewpoints, and then there are some times you just have to figure out how to forge ahead. But let me give you a good example of what compassion looks like. So if you're a utility and you've got, let's say in California or Arizona or someplace, you've got all the solar coming on behind the grid. Now in Arizona, what the utility did, unfortunately, was they took a lot of money and they didn't tell anyone, and they hired they created these nonprofits to fight the solar industry, all sub rosa, not good stuff, right? And it created this incredible level of enmity between the solar people and those guys at Arizona Public Service. But there are other people who are saying, okay, if we're really gonna create solar and basically roll those electrons off our roof into the grid when we create a surplus and get net metering, so they're essentially paying us for all the surplus. And then at nighttime, or when it's cloudy, we're taking that power back from the utility, and our bill nets out to zero because we're producing as much as we use, but the utility was still providing that backup function. Oh, by the way, if I have an outage, I expect that guy to climb my pole and fix it. How fair is that, right? And I see some solar companies who are just like, well, to heck with the utility. You know, we just want them out of the way. No, they're a part of this conversation, and they need to be compensated fairly. Because among other things, if half of this room did solar and net zero and everything out, the other half would still have to pay for all the infrastructure, right? So there would be clear winners and clear losers. And what you really have to think about is how do you avoid creating that sort of bipolar situation and pull people along when you can, but when you can't, because we're facing these huge issues, when you don't compromise. And that is not an easy task. But to start by thinking about where you can be compassionate and reasoned and logical makes a lot of sense. Does that help? Anybody else?